Welcome to another edition of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad at the Bench. It's me, Eric, here with you. Urban archaeology is probably one of those things that can really be a savior when you're thinking about how best to build out a model railroad. Previously, we had talked about some alternatives that could go in place of the tunnels on Chicago Crossing. And one of those options was an expressway or an overpass. And that in particular seemed like a potential option for the right rear of the layout, where the stub yard meets the main line. Now, having gone back down there, done some measuring and done some careful thought, it doesn't look like that's really a good idea, in part because I think it will just look contrived. In other words, there's more effort to try to actually shoehorn an object like that into a small space than would make sense. In other words, it doesn't seem like it would belong there. Well, it so happens that a couple of days ago, I was browsing through Google Earth over Chicago, trying to identify other possible solutions to the conundrum of what goes in the right rear of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad where that tunnel was. And it's something like this. So let's take a close look at what this is, and then let's go down into the train room and make a cardboard mock-up of it and see how it actually looks on the layout. So while I was browsing across the city of Chicago, something I was really looking for was interesting shapes of railroad tracks curving off into one direction or another, because that's frankly the situation down on the layout. Well, it just so happens that over by what I used to know as Comiskey Park, I think it's, I don't even know what it is anymore. Anyway, I found this building right here. So this building appears to be simply a storage warehouse. It is 5 floors high. Looks like it was probably built in the late 19th or early 20th century. What you'll notice about it is that it's actually shoehorned between an interchange track coming over here to interchange with another railroad, a bunch of track over here, and this gets interesting, trackage over here from another railroad that would be interchanged by this track over here. This eventually is abandoned over here. And then even over here, there's another interchange track that goes back off to connect to this main line over here. So essentially what you have is a building that is surrounded on all four sides by railroad tracks. So how does the structure actually negotiate this? Well, this is where things get really interesting and potentially really compelling as we think about how Chicago Crossing could potentially use a structure like this. Number one, if we zoom out and basically just go back to 2D, what you notice is it is a really odd shaped lot. It is triangular in shape. You have the mass of the building, which, as many buildings do near railroads, cuts in on a diagonal and even has a strangely tiny little spot over here. This actually reminds me of the Pickens Cane warehouse over on the north side as well. It doesn't appear that, at least as of now, this industry or this warehouse is rail served. In fact, it may never have been. I don't see evidence of loading doors down there. But then you notice there's a relatively small parking lot, and that lot fills out the rest of the space. And then you have trees that grow around where the railroad tracks are and where the land is fallow. So if we come back to 3 dimensions and just kind of stroll around the building, you'll notice that as a scenic object, this is really, really cool. So you have a lot of different adaptations to windows, including blocking them off, putting in glass block with smaller sash windows and the like. You notice the roof is really, really cool. You have quite a bit of patching and degradation on there. You have various penthouses for elevators. And you come over here, you've got different double sash windows over here. On the backside, you have fire escapes and a lot of really interesting stuff. This is a cool structure, and it's got a lot of history to it. And from a scenic perspective, it's really nice. The other thing is, if you look at how one accesses this building, it's actually really neat because you essentially have just one underpass underneath the railroad that gets you over to where this structure is, and then you have a relatively small lot. Now, this is not exactly the same shape as the lot size over in Chicago Crossing, but it gives you a really good example and a lot of inspiration as to how we might be able to adapt something like this into the world of the layout. And the building as a whole provides a really cool template for a particular mass and size of a structure, and then how it fits into the neighborhood around it. So with that in mind, I think this provides some really interesting opportunities to think about how to take a building, modify it to its surroundings in terms of using angled walls, and then to place it in a arrangement that feels fairly organic. So let's head on down to the train room. I think it's probably worth seeing how we can build a cardboard mock-up of something that seems like this, that might actually fit into that corner of the layout. All right, as you can see, we've got pieces for mocking up our building. I've got 4 sets of 3-inch walls, a 5, and then a 9.5. So the structure itself is basically sort of a 6-sided interesting thing, but that'll fit into the footprint. And then what I've done here is to cut little connectors that can help hold these pieces together. So those will get adhered down first. And here is the roof of the building that I can just set on. I don't really necessarily need to attach it. But anyway, as you can see, this is basically the rough mass of a structure that could fit in that spot. So let's actually turn around and take a look at how this plays with the layout. All right, let's get this building mock-up put into place here. And let's see how it looks on the layout. So what I'm doing now is I'm putting it into the precise footprint that I had drawn, with the understanding that this building is probably about maybe 3/8 of an inch wider because of these joints. But in any case, let's zoom out and just get a sense of how this actually looks in context on the layout. Now, the 5-inch mark made sense if I wanted to use an ITLA kit that was would give me about 5 floors according to the prototype. The degree of compression that is happening here, in other words, the building is not quite as long, means that you're basically creating something that's kind of a bit blocky and stubby here. The other thing is, there's really not a lot of setback from the track, and that's true on both sides. So from my perspective here, I would argue this is probably too big. It's too massive. The other element to keep in mind is there is probably a worthwhile element of forced perspective where maybe things in the background become a little bit less prominent than this. So I think the next step is to make a smaller version of this mock-up. What I would argue is we are looking at a building width here of about 5.5 inches, and of course the 5-inch height. This should probably come down by about 80%, and this should probably shrink by probably an equal amount, so about 4 by 4 in length or width on this side. I think the length is fine, but we just need to be able to shrink things down a little bit. I would also argue that it might be worthwhile to actually extend this building a little bit more this way in line with the prototype, and to have the diagonal come maybe a little bit more like this. So let's redesign a mock-up that satisfies those criteria. As you can see, I'm in mid-fabrication for this mock-up. Now, something to just describe here is actually a much quicker way than what I showed you initially to make cardboard mock-ups. So before I was cutting individual pieces, here what I'm doing just to kind of speed things up is I am using a score and fold technique. So basically what I'm doing is I'm drawing the lines that I want to make the cuts at, and then basically just taking my cutter and making a scoring cut rather than a cut all the way through. This will weaken the cardboard selectively at that joint, so that means it will just fold into the shape that I want rather than coming apart and requiring me to glue pieces together. So basically here's the other wall, so you can just see how that ends up working. So you pretty much immediately get your shape of interest. So let's go ahead and get this finished. All right, let's come back to the layout and see how a structure that is a little bit lengthened but also reduced in height and reduced in width fits on there. So once again, the building is angled on both sides to be able to accommodate the curves in the track. So what you can see is, yeah, it's absolutely shorter. It still functions as a view block for the trackage moving behind it over to the yard. So that's not bad. The scale of the building certainly is a little bit improved. It's not quite as prominent as it was before. And the length is actually kind of nice. Like, we can accommodate that on the layout. I think we're certainly getting there. I don't know that this is really the final set of dimensions here. I still suspect maybe there's a little more adjusting to do, and maybe even just a little bit of refinement in terms of how the building follows the trackage. But what you can at least get an appreciation of is that by going a bit smaller and maybe by going a bit longer, we get maybe a bit more scenic integration of that building. We could probably even skinny it up a little bit more so that we can have a layer of brush and small trees in between the building and the trackage, much as you see in the prototype. That could actually really help to also integrate this much more cleanly into the scene. Anyway, let's take a look at the other side of the layout. I pulled the layout away from the wall just so we can get a little bit of a view as to what things look like back there. Well, here we are on the back side of the layout, just to give you a little bit of sense of scale and a little bit of a sense of how we can potentially integrate this building scenically into the layout over on this side. So first off, what you can see is we've got the back area with the unballasted track over here. I've brought a truck with the idea that probably there's 1 to 2 loading bays over in the back of this building, or even an internal bay, sort of like you see in the prototype photo, where very likely these trucks just drive in. So if that's the case and we just have one large access door into the building for a truck, then you can see the truck, if it backs up and it's about this size, it clears the track well enough for rolling stock to come through. And at the same time, it maybe obviates the need for all of this stuff over here to be pavement. You can imagine that maybe the truck backs in this way and is basically to the loading dock itself. So all of this can actually become trees that would be really nice as a way to further create a view block over on this side without extending the building in really, really weird angles that it may not be best suited to occupy. And again, that fits with the overall spirit of the prototype. So over here, one possibility is actually just to create a section of buried track. And what that means is buried in concrete, so that trains can pass through here, but then trucks also can freely move and pivot as they need. Either that or just having one railroad crossing is, again, totally fine in one of these positions or other. This catch hole is no longer necessary, so that'll be filled in. And I'll take you over to the side around here, just so you can see what things look like back here. So eventually there will be a scenic backdrop over here, probably with some building flats. So the nice thing is, anybody who happens maybe at a railroad show or something like that to view Chicago Crossing from this angle would get a really nice sort of alley view of the layout. And once again, over here, you have the opportunity to have more scenery, brush, fallow land, weeds, things like that. Possibly even just like junk or boxes, crates, containers, you name it. Anything can go in here in order to further enhance the scenic value of the building. So, moral of the story is I think we're getting there in terms of being able to identify what the final shape and size of a structure like this would be. Clearly bringing it down an inch and bringing it in a little bit is helpful. It can be a skinny building, and that's completely fine. I think at this point, relative to what was initially here, the first mock-up, this scales much better. And so I think there's opportunities for a little bit of further building and refinement of what is here. And at that point, choosing how best to actually construct it using either kit bashing approaches or just a straight up scratch build in order to achieve some of the aesthetic features of the prototype itself. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. I think it's a good first start. And it also is an identifier of just why cardboard mock-ups have a high degree of value. Because within about 15 minutes, I essentially explored two different options in terms of size and scale of a structure. And it was very clear that what I was thinking initially was overly massed for the space that's over here. And that this idea now is more in line, both in terms of feasibility and in terms of scale with the rest of the railroad. So we might even knock it down a little bit more. We might shrink it a little bit in the width direction a little bit more in order to better scenic the area next to the track while allowing trains to continue to clear that. That's the opening bid for making a new model in a new area. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Hope you have a great rest of the weekend. If you are celebrating Father's Day, happy Father's Day. And otherwise, talk to you next time.